Hello and welcome to another video in the series Archaeology and Islam. My name is Dan Gibson, and in this video we want to examine the two prophets known as Hud and Salih. Information about both of these prophets is found in the Qur'an, where Hud is mentioned 7 times and Salah is mentioned 10 times. But outside of the Qur'an, it is a problem to find anything about these prophets. I have not found them in any of the hadiths except once, in Al-Tirmidhi's hadiths, which we will look at the very end of the video. Hud and Salih are not found in the archaeological records. Not even their names are found. They're not common anyway in the graffiti that's written all over the Middle East, from the Levant all the way down to Saudi Arabia. Everything we know about them comes from the Qur'an, with just a little added information from some old Arabian folk tales, but it's very hard to tell what is accurate and what is not accurate in those folk tales. Now, around 170 years after the Hijrah, Al-Kisai, he wrote a book called The Stories of the Prophets, in which he included some further information taken from earlier folk accounts. Now, these are not terribly reliable accounts, so we can't use them as real academic sources, but they do provide some interesting ideas about what was thought long ago. For instance, while the Quran tells us that Hud lived during the days of the people of Ad, it mentions Ad's lofty pillars and so forth, but that story grew with the retelling of folk tales that were told and retold every time until the story just grew up. And it ended up with stories about the people of Ad and their city of Aram, which was an unexplored area in Yemen. I imagine there was all kinds of other cities around, so they had to pick some place that was isolated, and so they picked that place, someplace off in Yemen, somewhere down over in the mountains. So the descriptions of Aram grew until the lofty pillars in the Quran became multicolored columns adorning the houses. The city grew until it was over 5 kilometers in every direction. The walls were now red bricked and over 200 meters high and 10 meters across, with 4 huge majestic gates. It contained 300,000 villas with thousands of pillars of gold-bound jasper, and in the villas on the floors were great pearls and fist-sized balls of spices like musk and saffron. When one looks down from the roof or from the balconies on the villas, they could see rivers of water like running underneath them. And the main streets were lined with fruit trees and with tall palms, and the story goes on and on. It's said that when news of this city reached Muawiyah, the son of Sufyan, who was the Caliph, but he had not yet moved his capital to Damascus. So he wrote this about this down to his lieutenant in Sana'a in Yemen, and he said, "Send your historians and your storytellers. I want to question them about the truth of the reports." Even after he heard their claims, he could not believe them. The old men told him that what Allah had blotted out the road which led to the city, so it will stand unchanged, undiscovered until the day of resurrection and the hour of judgment. Now those are the stories that are told. That's not from the Quran, that's not even from the Hadith, those are just from ancient stories. So in the story, though, there are bits and pieces of truth. The city of Aram and the people of Ad did exist, but they're now lost. That much I can accept. Now, there are a couple abandoned cities in the deserts in Yemen, most dating back to the time of the collapse of the Marib Dam. So the ruins do stand there in the desert. I've personally visited some of these places. And so here are some of the ruins sticking out of the sand in the desert. Now, these have been excavated today. When I was there years ago, took pictures of these ruins. And there's a complete walled city standing empty in the desert. But there's no gold and silver, no spices, no city of Aram, no evidence of the ancient people of Ad in Yemen. However, even to this day, I find some historians and some scholars who still repeat the old stories about the people of Ad and the buried cities in the deserts of Yemen or just over the border in Oman and so forth. I first entered the empty quarter in 1981, and I traveled throughout Oman and Yemen. I visited places and photographed many places. I have not yet found a single piece of firm evidence that supports the famed colonnaded city of Aram in Yemen or in Oman. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I think it does exist, and I think I know which pile of ruins is that city, but once again, it's a geographical problem. I think the ancient storytellers did us a disfavor by identifying a place in Yemen that was inaccessible to most people, and in the end, everyone started looking in the wrong places, and all down through history, the stories that have been told in poems have been written, and they all sort of focus on Yemen, the wrong place. Now, I find these two prophets are fascinating, and I think we can learn a couple of very important lessons from them about archaeology and the Quranic record. First, from the Qur'an, we learn very little about the geography of these two stories. We are not told where these two prophets were, other than the people that they were associated with, Hud and Thamud. We can infer answers, and we're told very little direct information. Of the references we have in the Qur'an to Hud and Salih, a number of them are just lists of prophets, so we can ignore those. And so let's start with Hud. The Qur'an says, "And to Hud, their brother Hud, he said, 'My people, O my people, serve God.'" This is the only geographical reference we have. And the trouble is, there's disagreement over where Hud is located. And to this day, no ruins have been found that can definitely be associated with an ancient kingdom known as Hud. Among Muslim scholars, the most common place quoted is a valley between Yemen and Oman. Some call it Wadi al-Mughith. Now, when I was a young man, I spent nearly 4 years in Yemen. During that time, I and several of my friends searched out many fascinating places. Among the places I was interested in was finding the famed Wadi Mughith. Today, I am convinced that the land of Hud was not in a valley by that name, and definitely not in Yemen or Oman. As I have said before, I believe that in ancient times there was a great federation of Arabian tribes that swept across the Arabian grasslands. These grasslands have since turned into desert. These horsemen of Arabia have left their memory in Jordan, Saudi, Yemen, Oman, even in Syria. So there is a memory of this nation in Yemen and in Oman, but they're not exclusive. Those memories also come from many other different countries. I believe the Egyptians called them the Shasu. Once they were organized, this federation of Shasu, this tribesmen, overran the Arabian Peninsula and even invaded down into Egypt. After 100 years in Egypt, the Egyptians threw them off and the federation disintegrated and individual tribes emerged. I believe that their base of power was in the mountains of Seir, based on the ancient name of Uz in the Bible, which I think points to these mountains. Plus, I think that the descriptions of Hud fit the story of Uz, and I think their names are very close to each other. One is Uz and one is Uz, and so if you put those together, they're very, very similar. Now, in the Quran, Hud warns the people of Hud to follow God or judgment's going to come. We are given a hint when in verse 69 of the Quran, which associates Hud with the successors of Noah, and it thus places the story in a very early date. These are the people after Noah. I place the formation of this federation somewhere between 1680 BC and 1580 BC, when at the end, Ahmosi, the first of Egypt, he defeats them and he expels them and throws off this federation of Arab tribes, which breaks up then, and individual nations of Edom, the Amalekites, Moab, Midian, the Amorites emerge. It's at this time that the Hittites and the Hivite people also begin to emerge, although the Hittites, who move north, will not reach their zenith for another 200 years. This explains the emergence of all of these small groups sort of at once in the Levant area. The presence of this very old story in the Qur'an is a testimony to the power of oral communication. By the time Muhammad addressed this story, 2,000 years had passed, and still the story's alive. It finds its way into the Qur'an, and it finds its way into the stories told by the bards and the traveling storytellers, because 500 years after Muhammad died, the story is still alive. This time, during the early Abbasid era, the stories are beginning to be written down in various collections. They had different titles, and there were different collections of stories by different writers at different times. Now here's a photo of a page from a collection of stories written down in the early Abbasid period. So these books were around and they were there. The Persians later get a hold of this story and put it together and wrap it all up as one continuous story after the other, and they call it 1001 Nights. And yet, you go back, you'll find some of these stories go very far back in history. So Hud can be found in 3 places: in the Qur'an, in early stories that were told in coffee shops and bazaars, and in the book written by Ibn Qasai known as the Stories of the Prophets. Now, this was the first of several books that had that title. So it's not a well-known book, his book, but it is out there. Now, in the Qur'an, in chapter 11, there is this chapter 11 is named Hud, and it starts out with a warning to the people that they should submit to God. First, Noah is addressed, and we hear his message, warning the people of his day that judgment is coming, and it's going to come in the form of a flood. This takes us all the way down to verse 50, where the subject switches to the prophet Hud and the people of Ud, and once again the messenger warns them to turn to God or judgment will come. Chapter 11, called Hud, does not tell us what that judgment will be. It's not until we get to chapter 26 in the Quran that we begin to learn more about the people of Ud and what happened to them. Again, Hud comes as a warner, and in this chapter it repeats much of his message, and we are told in verse 128 that the people of Ud built on every high place. This is significant because it signifies mountains and high places. It also refers to pagan altars being built on these locations. So I have visited many of these kinds of altars in the Middle East. High places. Here is one, and here is another one. Now this altar has 2 parts to it. One for the killing the animal and draining the blood, and the second altar for burning the animal. The Quran tells us that the people of Ud started to build altars on the high places and even strongholds in the mountains. Between the mountains were valleys with gardens and springs of water. So Ud lives in a mountainous country with lush valleys. And they made altars on the mountains. Then it adds, "Dost thou not consider how thy Lord dealt with Ud, with many-columned Aram, the like of which was not created in the land?" We'll come back in a moment to Aram. But first, let's look at chapter 89, Surah 89 of the Quran. And here we read, "And the Ud, they were destroyed by a great and furious wind, exceedingly violent. He made it rage against them 7 nights and 8 days in succession, so that thou couldst not see people lying prostrate in its path, quoting from an English version of the Qur'an. So, what is this story? It repeats itself several times in the Qur'an. First, Noah came as a warner of coming judgment. And if the people did not change, then the earth would be destroyed by a flood. And it was. Then Hud comes with the people of Hud, and he warns them of coming judgment. If they did not change, then they would be destroyed, and that destruction came by a great wind. In the biblical story of Job, the people are living in the land of Uz, also with that name, and they were also destroyed by a great wind. So both the land of Uz and the land of Uz are destroyed by a great wind. I see them as the same. They're about the same time, and they have a very similar name, and both of them are destroyed by this great wind. Both of them live in the mountainous areas. People are building altars in high places, gardens in the valleys. It's not Wadi al-Mughith in Yemen. It is up in southern Jordan in Mount Seir, which much later is where they built the city of Petra. So in summary, I place the prophet Hud around 1750 BC in the land of Edom, which was called the land of Uz at that time. I see an association between the names Uz and Ad, as I said, and I place the story in the Petra Mountains, and I place the city of Aram in the location of Wadi Rum. And the great columns in Wadi Rum are the great mountain cliffs that surround the city. Lawrence of Arabia, not knowing about Ad down in the Qur'an, he called them the 7 pillars of wisdom. He wasn't even thinking of the people of Ad, but he recognized these great pillars made out of the mountains the way they were shaped. Since these surahs are called Meccan surahs, they would have been given in and around the city of Petra. Muhammad need only to point to the high place altars on every mountain and the gardens in the narrow lush valleys. He needed to only point out and make reference to the lofty pillars in Aram. And everyone knew what he was talking about. You see, Muhammad was speaking to the people who lived right in the location where they were. This was their history. So he didn't need to explain to them where the land of Uz was located. His audience knew where they were. And his audience knew what he was talking about. Next we come to the prophet Salah. Again, we struggle to know where was he and to whom was he speaking. Salah also comes as a warner to tell of future judgment. But he comes to the people of Thamud. In this case, I understand the name Thamud to be made up out of 2 words. Tham, which means before, and Ud, there again, is the people of Ad, or the people of Uz, or just called Thamud, the people who come after Ud, and this is put together, and this is the people of Thamud. And we have a problem finding a tribe called Thamud, because there is no tribe named Thamud. It simply references the people who took over the area after the people of Ad. And if we understand this as being the people that lived in greater Petra after Ad, then it seems to be a reference to the Nabataeans. Now, there is something we need to get clear here. There are 2 usages for the word Nabataean. One of them applies to language. So linguistically, there were Nabataeans who spoke the Nabataean language. They are the true Nabataeans, if you want us to put it that way. But there's another group of Nabataeans, and they include all those people who joined with the Nabataeans, or who were part of a federation of tribes that worked and cooperated together in the deserts of Arabia. They had related languages, but not exactly the same language. So archaeologists have struggled to know how to classify these languages, and they're often given names with A, B, and C, and different kinds of Thamudic or different types of languages from different places in Saudi Arabia. They're trying to figure this out, Yet Thamud, I think, simply refers to the people who came after the people of Ad. So we're not thinking here linguistically, we're thinking of a political federation. Now Josephus tells us that in his day it was the Nabataeans who conferred the name of their name on the Arabian nations. This is not a linguistic statement. It speaks about the Nabataeans leading a federation of people. These people had grouped together for various reasons: cooperation in trade, a defense against outside threats, such as the growing strength of the Romans in the Middle East. So Josephus tells us that this group is there, these Nabataeans. He says specifically, quote, "It was the Nabataeans who conferred their name on the Arabian nations," unquote. So, this is not linguistically, we're talking about a group of people gathering together, but under the name Nabataean. So, Muhammad does not use the name Nabataean here. He is speaking of something else, much larger than the ethnic linguistic Nabataeans. He simply calls them the people after Ad, or the Thamud. Now, regarding Salah, he becomes as a prophet to the Thamud. And he comes to these people to warn them of coming judgment if you do not turn to God. Surah 7 of the Qur'an specifically tells us that the Thamud were the successors of Ad. In the same place, they were just the people who came after them. So we're still back in Petra Mountains. He tells them that they hew houses out from the mountains and they build large buildings out on the plains. And in verse 78, it tells us that an earthquake seized them and many people died in the dwelling places. Now we know the city of Petra has experienced many earthquakes, right up until only 19 years before the birth of the Prophet Muhammad. Now, note that in Surah 27, verse 45, the people of Thamud were split into two factions, the righteous and the unrighteous. Very strange kind of term. And the righteous escape and the unrighteous get judged. The Qur'an tells us that God took away the righteous. He moved them away so they wouldn't be judged. Okay? And I think that happened in the years following 106 AD, when the ruling Nabataean merchants moved off to Alexandria and even to Rome itself, where they became known as the merchants of Rome. The other people, the poor, the mixed motley crew of people who had come to live in that city, they were left behind. So there are two groups of people. And that group left behind, they struggled on, and eventually many of them, whom Muhammad calls the unrighteous, died in the earthquakes that rattled Petra in May 19, 363 AD. We can give it right down to the date. This is most likely the earthquake that is referred to here with Salah. Now, what I say next is my own thinking, and I want you to understand that this part is my theory, a proposition of what happened to the Nabataean people. Because some people say, well, what happened to the Nabataeans? I'm not going to be able to defend all my thinking in this video. I'm just going to introduce the idea. I have thought a lot about this over the last 20, 30 years. And I've been collecting evidence to support this, but I have yet to write it up. So you may find my thinking interesting. Hopefully that's all it is. Please don't come back and say, you got to prove it to me. But in brief, my suggestion is that after 106 AD, many of the rich and powerful Nabataeans moved away to Alexandria and then some off to Rome. I have had fun tracing them into these places and finding evidence of them, of their wealth, of their language, of their burial customs. And so these rich Nabataeans become wealthy merchants of Rome rather than the Arab merchants of Nabatea. Previously, they were the bane of the Roman Empire because they were siphoning funds away from the Roman Empire. Now, as Roman citizens, the funds were staying inside the Roman Empire. You see, these merchants saw what happened to Jerusalem in 70 AD. They were there. There was a group of soldiers that were sent there. I think 2,000 or so horsemen were there, 2,000 anyway, mounted troops that were there at Jerusalem. They knew what was coming. They knew what would happen if they ever stood against Rome. And so I believe they did what merchants do best. They sold their position in exchange for Roman citizenship. So in 106 AD, the Romans took over, and Romans published a fascinating coin to commemorate the occasion. That coin celebrated acquired Arabia, not conquered Arabia. I believe that these rich merchants, they traded their kingdom in exchange for Roman citizenship for the leading citizens that were there. And so they became businessmen in Rome. In effect, Nabataean merchants disappear. Merchant class of Rome emerges in full force, trading with India, trading with China, great wealth being piled up. But we're way off track. So, what became of Petra? At this point, Petra was left with the leftovers. And there are a lot of polytheists there and others. The wealthy have left, and but there are many other people who are still in the city and others arriving. So the Nabataean merchants are gone. The city becomes a true cosmopolitan metropolis. So Muhammad speaks of these two groups of Thamud. The first group, the good people, have moved away. They escape judgment. The judgment that's brought by the earthquakes is on the bad people who remained, and they suffered from the earthquakes. Muhammad knew about earthquakes firsthand. He and his people and his tribe had suffered through earthquakes as well because they were in that city. So, when Muhammad becomes a messenger of God, he begins to preach judgment on the polytheists. If they do not turn to God, they will be judged, just like the people of Noah, just like the people of Hud, and just like the people of Salah. That is what is in Surah chapter 11 of the Qur'an, known as Hud. The whole story from Noah to Hud to Salah and to the others. The Qur'an speaks of this time and time again. This grouping of people and the stories and the judgment is repeated in multiple times in the Qur'an. But there's one problem. Muhammad is preaching judgment, but judgment never comes. Instead, Muhammad is scoffed at. His followers are persecuted. They end up going off down into Abyssinia, back down into Africa, and then they come back over when things get better, but the persecution starts again, and so they end up moving off to Medina. Now, in Al-Tirmidhi's hadith, we said we'd get back to this hadith, there is an interesting story, so I'm going to read it for you, and just so you get it. It says, when some people remarked to Allah's messenger, peace be upon him, that he had become gray-haired, he replied, Surah Hud and those which are similar to it have made my hair gray. Now, why would that be? What is in Surah Hud and in the other surahs like it, such as 26 and 46? In these surahs, Muhammad predicts doom and judgment. And it's going to come just like in Noah, just like in Hud, just like in Salah. Judgment is going to come, but in the end, no judgment came. So he had to go to Medina with his followers without seeing judgment coming on the original city. But something happened in Medina. You can see it more clearly in the Quran if you group the surahs in the Quran in a chronological order as they were revealed, rather than from the longer ones to the shorter ones. In Medina, Muhammad's message begins to change. He no longer preached God will bring some catastrophe. Slowly he begins to see that his men and his army will bring that catastrophe. So they will be the means of judgment. Judgment will come, but it will come at the hands of the Muslim forces who will bring God's judgment on others. And this is the theme that goes all the way through history of the Muslims as they come and bring this judgment. So we could spend a lot of time digging around in Hud and Salah and so forth, and we could dig into those folk tales. Maybe we will sometime have time to examine them and what they say about the land of Ud and so forth. So up to this point, I've been talking about the prophets. Now, I have 2 more videos I want to do in this series, and then we will change our focus, and we are going to start another series. And I'm going to want to call that Early Islamic Qiblas. And we want to examine in each episode a couple of the mosques that are already in the database. And then we want to add 1 or 2 new mosques that we haven't talked about, you haven't seen listed in the database, because some of you listeners have been going out and measuring mosques that live close to you and writing back to me and saying, have you checked this mosque? What about this mosque? And so those keep coming in. And so now I have a whole collection of these. And so I thought it would be fun if we could make some videos. We will look at some we've already examined that are in the database, and then we'll add 1 or 2 of these others. And each week we will have a chance to look at some of these mosques. Where did they point? Did they point to Petra? Did they point to Mecca? Did they point in between? Or are they simply that people locally had their own ideas, and maybe here locally they went here, or maybe it was somewhere else? We'll have a look and we'll delve into some of those ideas and see what we can learn from the early Islamic Qiblas. But first, 2 more videos in this series, and then we will start on the new series. So I'm Dan Gibson, and this has been another video in the series Archaeology and Islam.